On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. The Great War was over. Britain had won. The Union Jack flew over the largest empire in human history, a colossus that covered a quarter of the globe. In London, crowds danced in Trafalgar Square, celebrating the triumph of democracy over Prussian militarism. To the outside world, Britain appeared as mighty as ever, the undisputed master of the global order. But inside HM Treasury and Whitehall, there was no celebrating. The men who looked at the nation as ledgers knew a terrifying secret. The victory had bankrupted the victor. Britain had fought the war on a scale of expense that was previously unimaginable. To finance the sprawling armies and vast fleets needed to defeat Germany, Britain had burned through enormous reserves of national wealth. They had liquidated their foreign investments, selling off railways in Argentina and mines in Africa to pay for American steel and Canadian wheat. When those reserves ran dry, they turned to borrowing. Britain ended the war drowning in debt. The national debt had exploded from roughly £600 million in 1914 to £7 billion in 1918. Crucially, much of this debt was owed to the United States, and it had to be repaid in dollars. The Britain that emerged from the trenches in 1919 was a fundamentally different economic animal than the one that had gone to war in 1914. Before the war, Britain was the world's creditor. Now it was a debtor. Before the war, British industry dominated global trade. During the war, while British factories were turning out artillery shells, the engines of the British economy were sputtering. But the British elite refused to accept this new reality. They viewed the economic damage of the war not as a permanent shift, but as a temporary aberration. They believed that with the war over, the natural order of things would reassert itself, with London at the center of the financial universe. There was a desperate, almost psychological hunger to return to normalcy, and for the British ruling class, normalcy meant one thing above all else: the gold standard. For nearly a century before the war, the gold standard had been the anchor of the global economy. It was a system of fixed exchange rates. Every major currency was pegged to a specific amount of gold. You could walk into the Bank of England with a £5 note and demand 5 gold sovereigns in exchange. Because the British pound was as good as gold, it became the world's reserve currency. Global trade was conducted in sterling. This financial dominance was the bedrock of British imperial power. To these men, abandoning the gold standard during the war had been an emergency measure, a temporary deformation that needed to be corrected. They saw the gold standard not merely as an economic tool, but as a moral imperative, a symbol of British credibility and strength. Without it, they believed, Britain would be chaos. Inflation would ravage the currency, and the empire itself would begin to crumble. In 1924, the Conservative Party won the general election, and Stanley Baldwin appointed Winston Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Churchill was a brilliant orator and a masterful wartime leader, but economics was not his strength. He was, by all accounts, a compulsive gambler, a poor stock market investor, and chronically in debt himself. Yet here he was, entrusted with the economic future of an empire. Churchill initially harbored doubts about returning to the gold standard. He consulted widely, including with a young economist named John Maynard Keynes, who warned him repeatedly of the dangers. Keynes argued that Britain's economy was too weak, too changed by the war to sustain the pound at its pre-war value. He explained that pegging sterling to gold at the old rate of $4.86 would mean the pound was overvalued by roughly 10% compared to its actual market value. This overvaluation, Keynes warned, would make British exports prohibitively expensive. Coal, steel, textiles, the bloodline of British industry, would become uncompetitive in global markets. But Keynes was a lone voice crying in the wilderness. The prevailing orthodoxy, championed by the Bank of England's governor Montague Norman and Treasury Controller Otto Niemeyer, drowned him out. Norman, in particular, was dogmatic. He believed that the gold standard was not merely an economic policy, but the foundation of civilization itself. When industrialists and manufacturers expressed concerns about the impact on their businesses, Norman dismissed them with contempt. Their views on economics, he said, were comparable to asking shipyard workers what they thought about the design of a battleship. On April 28, 1925, Churchill stood before Parliament and announced that Britain would return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. His speech was stirring. He spoke of shackling Britain to reality, of building economic policy on a foundation of truth rather than paper illusions. The policy, he said, would restore confidence, stabilize prices, and cement Britain's place at the center of the global economy. It will shackle us to reality, he declared. For good or ill, it will shackle us to reality. The House cheered. The City of London celebrated. Financial elites toasted the restoration of British greatness. But out in the coal towns of Wales, the shipyards of Scotland, and the textile mills of Lancaster, the applause died quickly. The consequences of Churchill's decision were immediate and devastating. By fixing the pound at $4.86 when its real market value was closer to $4.40, British coal, which was already struggling to compete with cheaper American and Polish coal, became unaffordable. British steel, British textiles, British manufactured goods, all were suddenly priced out of international markets. Demand collapsed, orders dried up, factories began to close. The burden of this policy did not fall on the bankers and financiers who championed it. It fell on the workers. To remain competitive, British exporters had to cut costs, which meant cutting wages. In July 1925, just 3 months after the gold standard was restored, Keynes published a scathing pamphlet titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. He laid bare the mechanics of the disaster. By raising the value of sterling by 10%, Churchill's policy demanded a corresponding 10% reduction in wages across the economy. Mr. Churchill's policy of improving the exchange rate by 10%, Keynes wrote, was, sooner or later, a policy of reducing everyone's wages by 2 shillings in the pound. The coal miners were the first to feel the knife. Britain's coal industry, bloated and inefficient from overuse during the war, was already hemorrhaging money. Mine owners, squeezed by falling prices and rising costs, announced they would cut miners' wages and increase working hours from 7 to 8 hours a day. The miners, already among the lowest-paid workers in Britain, refused. Their leader, A.J. Cook, rallied them with a simple, defiant slogan: "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." When negotiations collapsed, the mine owners locked out over 1 million miners on May 1, 1926. In solidarity, the Trades Union Congress called for a general strike. On May 3, 1926, 3 million workers across Britain walked off the job. Railway workers, dockers, transport workers, builders, printers, the arteries of the British economy seized up, the country ground to a halt. The government, led by Baldwin and Churchill, had been preparing for this moment for months. They had stockpiled 10 million tons of coal. They mobilized 30,000 volunteers, mostly from the middle and upper classes, to break the strike. University students drove buses and trains. Churchill took personal charge of the government's propaganda, editing the British Gazette. The strike lasted 9 days. On May 12th, the TUC, fearing legal repercussions and hemorrhaging strike funds, surrendered unconditionally. The workers returned to their jobs, defeated and humiliated. But the miners refused to give up. They stayed out alone, fighting for another 7 months. By November 1926, starvation and desperation forced them back to work. They accepted longer hours and lower wages. Many found there were no jobs left for them. Unemployment ravaged the mining communities of Wales, Scotland, and northern England. This was not a natural disaster. This was not an inevitable tragedy. This was a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice made by men who valued the prestige of the pound over the material lives of ordinary people. The gold standard, that sacred totem of British financial orthodoxy, demanded human sacrifice, and the British elite offered it willingly. Keynes understood what was happening. He described the coal miners as the victims of the economic juggernaut. They represent in the flesh, Keynes wrote, the fundamental adjustments needed to ensure the stability of the gold standard. In other words, the miners' suffering was not collateral damage, it was the point. The policy that Churchill and his advisors had implemented operated on a simple, brutal logic. If British goods were too expensive, British workers must be made cheaper. If exports could not compete at current wage levels, wages must fall. The alternative, admitting that the pound was overvalued and adjusting the exchange rate accordingly, was unthinkable. That would mean acknowledging weakness. That would mean accepting that Britain was no longer the financial colossus it had been before the war. And so the adjustment was forced not onto the currency, but onto the people. Unemployment soared. By 1931, it had reached nearly 3 million, over 20% of the insured workforce. The industrial heartlands of Britain became wastelands. In some towns in the northeast, where shipbuilding had once thrived, unemployment reached 70%. In Glasgow, 30% of the population was out of work. Entire communities were hollowed out. Soup kitchens proliferated. Families went hungry. Children grew up malnourished. The human cost of Churchill's decision was incalculable. The economic cost was equally catastrophic. Britain's export industries, already weakened by the war, were crippled by the overvalued pound. Coal production fell. Shipbuilding collapsed. The textile industry, once the engine of British prosperity, withered. Foreign competitors, unburdened by Britain's self-imposed handicap, surged ahead. American industry boomed. Japanese manufacturing expanded. Germany, despite the punishing terms of the Versailles Treaty, rebuilt its economy faster than Britain. By the time the Great Depression arrived in 1929, Britain was already in a state of economic distress. The gold standard, that supposedly stabilizing anchor, had become a millstone dragging the country down. In May 1931, Austria's largest bank, Creditanstalt, collapsed. The failure triggered a chain reaction of banking panics across Europe. By summer, the crisis had reached Britain. Investors, fearing that Britain could no longer sustain the overvalued pound, began a run on sterling. Gold poured out of the Bank of England's reserves. The government, desperate to defend the currency, raised interest rates to 6%, strangling what little economic activity remained. It was a policy of self-immolation. On September 19, 1931, the inevitable happened. Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard. The policy that had caused 6 years of mass unemployment, industrial decline, and human suffering was finally discarded. Not because its architects recognized their mistake, but because reality, the very reality Churchill had claimed to be shackling Britain to, had forced their hand. The irony was savage. Within months of leaving the gold standard, Britain's economy began to recover. The pound depreciated by 25% against the dollar, falling from $4.86 to $3.40. British exports became competitive again. Interest rates fell from 6% to 2%. Industries that had been on life support began to hire again. Unemployment, though still high, started to decline. By 1933, the economy was growing. The recovery would be slow and painful, but it had begun. It turned out that abandoning the gold standard was not the catastrophe its defenders had predicted. It was a liberation. Everything that had been inflicted on the British people since 1925, the wage cuts, the unemployment, the strikes, the suffering, had been unnecessary. It had been avoidable. The men who had championed the gold standard had not been defending economic stability. They had been defending an illusion. They had been defending the idea of British supremacy, the fantasy that the world could be forced to bend to London's will if only the right policies were imposed with sufficient rigidity. But economic realities are not impressed by imperial nostalgia. Markets do not care about national pride. And the British people, the workers in the coal mines and the shipyards and the textile mills, paid the price for their leaders' arrogance. The mechanics of how the gold standard crushed ordinary people were cold and precise. Between 1921 and 1929, wholesale prices in Britain fell by approximately 25%. This was deflation on a scale not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. In theory, falling prices should benefit consumers, making goods cheaper. But Britain's deflation was not natural market adjustment. It was imposed from above through deliberate policy. The overvalued pound forced British producers to cut costs relentlessly just to survive. Since they could not reduce the price of imported raw materials or the fixed exchange rate, the only variable left was labor. Wages had to fall. But workers did not surrender their livelihoods quietly. Between 1930 and 1932, more than 36% of British workers experienced wage cuts in a single year. In 1931 alone, more than 3 million workers saw their pay reduced. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had fought in the trenches, who had been promised a land fit for heroes, found themselves discarded by the very system they had defended. The government's response was to double down. In 1931, facing a run on sterling and hemorrhaging gold reserves, Chancellor Spildon Snowden imposed emergency budget cuts. Public sector wages were slashed by 10%. Unemployment benefits, already meager, were cut by 10%. Income tax on the wealthy was raised modestly, but the bulk of the burden fell on those already suffering. Even the Royal Navy was not spared. When sailors at the Invergordon Naval Base learned their wages would be cut, they refused orders in what became known as the Invergordon Mutiny. It was not a violent rebellion. The sailors simply stopped working. They had reached the breaking point. Their quiet defiance symbolized something profound. The social contract was shattering. These were not revolutionaries. These were men who had devoted their lives to defending the empire, and now the empire was asking them to starve quietly for the sake of financial orthodoxy. The mutiny terrified investors. If even the Navy could not be relied upon, what stability did Britain offer? The run on sterling accelerated. This is the central tragedy of Britain's return to the gold standard. It was a policy born not of necessity, but of vanity. It was a choice made by a small group of men, insulated from the consequences of their decisions, who prioritized the symbolic value of the pound over the material well-being of millions. They believed they were defending civilization. In reality, they were defending privilege. They believed they were acting in the national interest. In reality, they were serving the interests of the City of London's financial elite, who profited from high interest rates and a strong currency, while ordinary people starved. The lesson here is not complicated. When governments choose symbols over substance, ideology over evidence, prestige over people, disaster follows. The gold standard was not an economic policy. It was a monument to hubris, and the British people were sacrificed to preserve it. Keynes saw this clearly in 1925. He warned Churchill,
He warned the Bank of England. He warned anyone who would listen, and he was ignored. Because in the calculus of power, the voices of ordinary workers counted for nothing compared to the confidence of bankers and the pride of politicians. This pattern repeats throughout history. Leaders convinced of their own righteousness impose policies that transfer suffering onto those least able to bear it. They frame their decisions as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. They invoke tradition, stability, and national honor. And when the policy fails, when the suffering becomes undeniable, they are long gone, insulated by wealth and position from the consequences of their choices. Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925 is a case study in how economic policy becomes a weapon. It is a reminder that macroeconomic decisions are never neutral. They are always moral choices. They always involve trade-offs, and those trade-offs are almost never borne equally. The burden falls on the powerless. The benefits accrue to the powerful. The miners who marched back to work in defeat in 1926, the families who endured years of unemployment in the 1930s, the communities that never fully recovered, they were not victims of abstract economic forces. They were victims of specific decisions made by specific people. Winston Churchill chose to return to the gold standard. Montague Norman chose to dismiss the concerns of industrialists and workers. Stanley Baldwin chose to break the general strike. These were choices. And today, when governments tell us that austerity is necessary,
that wages must be controlled, that public services must be cut to maintain fiscal credibility, we should remember the gold standard. We should remember that economic orthodoxy is not always right. We should remember that the people who craft these policies rarely suffer from them. We should remember that prestige and stability are abstractions, but hunger and unemployment are real. The gold standard era ended in 1931, but its logic persists. The belief that markets must be appeased, that creditors must be paid, that the integrity of financial systems matters more than the well-being of ordinary people, this belief did not die with the gold standard. It simply found new forms, new vocabularies, new justifications. Every time a government chooses deflation over employment, every time austerity is imposed to satisfy international investors, every time workers are told their wages are the problem, the ghost of the gold standard is present. The British Empire did not fall because of external enemies. It fell because its leaders, when faced with the choice between adapting to a new reality and clinging to an old illusion, chose the illusion. They chose to protect the prestige of the pound rather than the prosperity of the people. They chose to preserve the appearance of strength rather than build actual resilience. And in doing so, they hollowed out the very foundation of the power they sought to protect. Economic suicide is not a metaphor. It is a description. It is what happens when a nation's elite, captured by ideology and divorced from the lives of ordinary citizens, makes policies that systematically undermine the productive capacity and social fabric of the country. Britain in the 1920s and 1930s was committing economic suicide. Slowly, deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. Because admitting weakness was unthinkable. Because changing course was impossible. Because the people who made the decisions were not the people who suffered them. This is the warning. This is the lesson. Power, when it insulates itself from accountability, when it prioritizes extraction over reality, when it treats human beings as variables in an economic equation, does not produce stability. It produces catastrophe. The gold standard fell in 1931, but the mindset that created it endures. And until we confront that mindset, until we demand that economic policies serve people rather than ideologies, the pattern will repeat. The sacrifices will continue, and those who wield power will continue to ask others to pay the price for their mistakes.